Have you ever felt that the deeper you think, the more isolated you become? That the more you understand the world, the less people want to hear what you have to say? It's not just in your head. Human history is filled with brilliant minds who were ridiculed, silenced, or completely ignored, not because they were wrong, but because they saw what others preferred not to see. Marcus observes the city from his 30th floor apartment. 42 years old, with deep eyes that seem to see beyond appearances, prematurely grey hair. On the shelf behind him, books organized not by author or color, but by the questions they attempt to answer. On his desk, a crumpled invitation to a conference where he was supposed to be the keynote speaker, cancelled. Again, have you ever wondered why certain people are left behind? Not the obviously different ones, but those whose only crime is thinking too deeply. Marcus had just received news that his research on unconscious consumption patterns would be too disturbing for the general public. As if truth were a pill too bitter to swallow without the sugar of ignorance. He watches people below, tiny as ants, following their predetermined paths. Work, home, entertainment, sleep. Repetition. An experiment conducted at Stanford University had demonstrated that when individuals are exposed to ideas that fundamentally challenge their beliefs, the amygdala region in the brain, responsible for fear, activates exactly as if they were facing a physical threat. Marcus feels the weight of intellectual solitude as a physical presence, not because he lacks social skills, but because his intelligence makes him stand out in a world that values fitting in over standing out. Think about this. When you stand next to someone physically stronger, you don't necessarily feel weak. You might admire their strength. When you meet someone wealthier, you might envy them, but you don't feel personally attacked. But when you encounter someone intellectually superior, something strange happens. Marcus sits alone at a cafe, notebook, open, pen poised over paper. 3 empty chairs surround his table. Earlier, he'd attempted to share an insight about mass psychology with colleagues. The conversation had quickly shifted to weekend plans. He'd seen the subtle eye rolls, the checked watches, the relief when the topic changed. Psychologists call this the mirror effect. A deep thinker doesn't just introduce new ideas, they reflect back the limitations of those around them, and people don't forgive that easily. The mere presence of someone who thinks deeply can make others feel inadequate, even if the deep thinker says nothing at all. Marcus observes a couple at the next table, engrossed in conversation about a reality TV show. He doesn't judge them, he studies them. What drives their passion for manufactured drama while real-world complexities go unexamined? His notebook remains empty as the waiter deliberately serves him last. Unlike physical strength or material wealth, intelligence is deeply tied to identity. We define ourselves by our thoughts, our beliefs, our understanding of the world. When we meet someone who thinks on a deeper level, someone who questions what we take for granted, it feels like a direct attack on our sense of self. The cafe slowly fills with the lunch crowd. A former student spots Marcus and hesitates, clearly torn between acknowledging him and pretending not to see. Marcus saves him the trouble with a small nod that releases the young man from any obligation to engage. He remembers when this student was eager, questioning everything, until academic pressures and social expectations gradually dulled that spark. A 2021 study at Stanford University uncovered something revealing. Our reaction to deep thinkers is context-dependent. When people interact with an intellectual one-on-one, they feel less threatened. But in group settings, the threat response spikes dramatically. Why? Because social status becomes more important in groups. People don't just react to intelligence itself, they react to how others perceive them in comparison. Marcus remembers the dinner party last month, where his comment about the philosophical implications of artificial intelligence cleared half the table within minutes. Yet the same ideas, shared with a single interested friend over coffee, led to hours of enriching conversation. The difference wasn't the content, but the context. One setting threatened social hierarchy, the other didn't. The mirror effect operates beyond conscious awareness. When the deep thinker speaks, the listener's brain is already preparing defenses, not against the ideas themselves, but against what those ideas reveal about the listener's own limitations. Neuroscience confirms this. When confronted with superior intelligence, the same brain regions activate that process threats to physical safety and social standing. Marcus pays for his coffee and leaves a generous tip, a small compensation for making the waiter uncomfortable simply by existing. Outside, he pauses to observe a street performer creating intricate chalk art that will wash away with the next rain. The artist works with intense focus, oblivious to passing criticism or praise. Marcus recognizes a kindred spirit, someone creating because they must, not for external validation. A memory surfaces, his mother's words when he was just 8 years old, already causing concern among teachers with his relentless questions. "You see too much, Marcus," she'd said, not unkindly. "Sometimes people prefer their reflections a little blurry." It was the first time he understood that his way of seeing created discomfort in others. 3 decades later, that insight remains, painfully relevant. The mirror effect explains why, throughout history, deep thinkers have been pushed to the fringes of society. Their insights don't just challenge ideas, they challenge egos, and human beings by nature will do almost anything to protect their ego from discomfort, including rejecting or attacking the messenger who brings uncomfortable truths. At its core, the human brain craves certainty and predictability. Evolution has programmed us to avoid mental discomfort, a phenomenon psychologists call cognitive ease. The brain prefers simple, familiar information because it requires less mental energy to process. Marcus walks through a bookstore, fingers trailing along spines in the philosophy section. He notices how thin this section is compared to the self-help aisle, where colorful covers promise simple solutions to complex problems. A memory surfaces, his publisher asking if he could make his ideas more accessible by adding 5 simple steps to happiness. Take a look at today's digital world. Who gets the most attention on social media? Not the intellectuals, but those who can reduce complex ideas into viral, feel-good sound bites. Thought-provoking discussions struggle to gain traction because depth takes time, while viral content is instant, emotional, and easy to digest. Marcus pauses by the bestseller display. Among celebrity biographies and diet books sits a single work of philosophy, its cover redesigned to look like a motivational poster. That's how Nietzsche survives in the modern marketplace, he thinks, reduced to inspirational quotes, stripped of their disturbing context. The rejection of deep thinking doesn't just happen online. It begins in the very institutions that shape our minds. Schools claim to value intelligence, but in reality, they reward obedience over independent thought. Students who memorize and regurgitate information succeed, while those who question or challenge authority are often labeled troublemakers. The bookstore's ambient music fades as Marcus becomes absorbed in his thoughts. He recalls his own education, how his kindergarten teacher had called his parents because he kept asking why long after other children had moved on. By high school, he'd learned to suppress the most probing questions, saving them for private research. By college, he'd found a few professors who valued his intellectual curiosity, small islands in a sea of institutionalized conformity. Psychologists have identified several cognitive biases that further explain why intelligence is often met with resistance. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows that people with low ability often overestimate their intelligence, while highly intelligent people tend to doubt themselves. This creates friction. Those who know little believe they know more than they do, leading them to dismiss deeper thinkers. Marcus picks up a book about cognitive biases, flipping to a dog-eared page about status quo bias, the brain's preference for familiar ideas over new, complex truths. Intelligence often introduces disruptive thoughts, making people uncomfortable. Another bias, the backfire effect, explains why, when people are confronted with information that contradicts their beliefs, they don't change their minds. They double down on existing views. A group of teenagers enters the philosophy section, laughing loudly. Marcus observes them picking up books, making jokes about the philosophers' names, putting the books back in wrong places. One girl, however, lingers behind the group, genuinely examining a volume of Camus. Their eyes meet briefly, recognition of a kindred spirit, before her friends call her away. Marcus wonders how long she'll maintain her curiosity before social pressure extinguishes it. The algorithms that govern our digital lives have only amplified society's rejection of intelligence. Designed to maximize engagement rather than understanding, they prioritize controversial, emotionally charged content over nuanced discussion. The average attention span continues to shrink, down to 8 seconds according to recent studies, shorter than that of a goldfish. In this environment, deep thinking isn't just discouraged, it's actively selected against. Marcus sits in the bookstore's cafe, watching people scroll through their phones. A 2020 MIT study found that false news spread 6 times faster than truth on social media platforms. Not because people necessarily prefer lies, but because novelty and emotional impact drive engagement. Complexity, nuance, and accuracy, the hallmarks of deep thinking, are casualties in the war for attention. Education theorist Neil Postman once argued that we're amusing ourselves to death, trading serious discourse for entertainment. Marcus sees this playing out as the bookstore promotes a social media influencer meet and greet, while philosophical works gather dust. There's a certain irony that Schopenhauer, who wrote about the futility of human desires, now sits forgotten on shelves, while books promising to fulfill those very desires become bestsellers. For deep thinkers like Marcus, navigating this landscape requires understanding that society's resistance isn't personal, it's systemic. From evolutionary psychology to educational structures to technological algorithms, multiple forces work against depth of thought. This doesn't mean deep thinkers should stop thinking, but it does mean they need to understand the forces working against them. As Marcus leaves the bookstore, he notices a small note tucked into a philosophy book he purchased. For those who still dare to think deeply. Written in precise handwriting, it seems to be from the bookseller, a small act of solidarity in a world that increasingly views deep thinking with suspicion. He tucks it into his pocket, a reminder that even in resistant soil, intellectual curiosity finds ways to grow. Throughout history, some of the most brilliant minds were not celebrated during their lifetimes. They were ridiculed, persecuted, or ignored. Their ideas were seen as dangerous, disruptive, or simply too difficult for society to accept at the time. Marcus stands before a painting of Socrates drinking hemlock. His fingers trace the philosopher's face on the museum brochure. The father of Western philosophy spent his life questioning commonly held beliefs, challenging people to think critically. His reward? A death sentence for corrupting the youth. His real crime, encouraging people to think for themselves. Galileo's only crime was discovering the truth. When he proved that the earth revolves around the sun, he shattered centuries of religious dogma. The church, which held power through controlling knowledge, branded him a heretic. He was forced to publicly deny his own discoveries under threat of torture. Marcus moves to a window overlooking the museum courtyard. A group of schoolchildren runs freely, their teacher struggling to corral them toward the next exhibit. He wonders, how many potential Galileos are among them, and how many will have their questions silenced before reaching adulthood? Nietzsche's work was considered too radical, too unsettling. He argued that traditional morality was flawed, that society was built on comforting lies. At the time, these ideas were too much for people to handle. He was dismissed as insane, his works ignored or misunderstood. Yet today, his philosophy influences psychology, literature, and existentialism. The museum's special exhibition features Nikola Tesla's inventions. Marcus pauses before a replica of his wireless energy transmission device. Tesla dreamed of providing free energy to the world, but his funding was cut when investors realized there was no profit in giving away electricity. Despite revolutionizing our understanding of electricity, Tesla died alone in a hotel room, nearly penniless, his papers confiscated by the government. A pattern emerges as Marcus studies these historical figures. Society doesn't merely ignore deep thinkers. It actively works to silence them when their ideas threaten existing power structures. Socrates could have escaped his death sentence, but chose to drink hemlock rather than compromise his principles. His famous words before death, "The unexamined, life is not worth living," still resonate with those who value truth over comfort. Marcus sits on a museum bench, watching visitors hurry past profound works without truly seeing them. He remembers teaching a university course on historically persecuted thinkers. One student had asked, "But surely things are different now. We value free thought in modern times." The question haunted him because the answer was both yes and no. Methods have become more sophisticated, but the outcome remains similar. The case of Alan Turing illustrates this persistent pattern. His work in cryptography helped end World War II, saving millions of lives. His theories in computing became the foundation of modern artificial intelligence. Yet, instead of being honored, he was persecuted for his personal life. In 1952, he was chemically castrated for being gay, a decision that led to his suicide at 41 years old. Today, Turing is recognized as a hero, but in his time, society discarded him despite his incredible contributions. A museum guide leads a tour group past Marcus, explaining how Galileo was eventually vindicated centuries after his death. The visitors nod appreciatively, comfortable with historical injustice safely contained in the past. Marcus wonders if they would recognize a modern Galileo, or if they too would join the chorus demanding silence from those who challenge comfortable beliefs. While most historical deep thinkers were men, Hypatia of Alexandria was a rare exception. A philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer who challenged the male-dominated intellectual world of ancient Rome. She taught scientific reasoning and rational thought, which put her at odds with religious authorities. In the year 415, a mob of religious extremists brutally murdered her, seeing her as a threat to their power. Marcus studies a small display about Ignaz Semmelweis, a 19th century physician who discovered that hand-washing could prevent the spread of disease in hospitals. His findings contradicted established medical theories, and rather than accepting this life-saving discovery, the medical establishment rejected him. His colleagues ridiculed him, and he was eventually committed to an asylum where he died just 2 weeks later from an infection, the very thing he had spent his life trying to prevent. The pattern continues with Gregor Mendel, whose groundbreaking work on genetics was ignored for 35 years. With Vincent van Gogh, who sold only one painting during his lifetime, but whose works now sell for hundreds of millions. With Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake for suggesting that stars might be distant suns with their own planets. Society doesn't fear intelligence itself. It fears what intelligence represents: change. As Marcus exits the museum, he notices a small, easily overlooked display. Unrecognized genius, those history forgot. It features innovators whose contributions were attributed to others or lost entirely. Women whose scientific discoveries were credited to male colleagues. Minority thinkers whose ideas were appropriated without recognition. The pattern of rejection isn't random. It follows lines of power, highlighting how threatening truly original a thought can be to established hierarchies. Outside, Marcus pauses before a statue of Leonardo da Vinci, one of the rare deep thinkers who found success during his lifetime. Yet even Leonardo kept his most revolutionary ideas in private notebooks, written in mirror script to prevent casual reading. Even he understood that society often wasn't ready for truly revolutionary thought. Marcus touches the cool marble base of the statue, feeling a connection across centuries with those who saw too clearly and paid the price. So if you've ever felt alone in your thoughts, know this: you are not broken. You are simply seeing the world for what it really is. But does this mean deep thinkers are doomed to isolation, or are there ways to navigate society while preserving intellectual depth? Marcus wakes before dawn, a habit formed over decades. The city sleeps as he begins his morning walk. The streets empty except for delivery trucks and early shift workers. In these quiet hours, he finds a strange communion with the world, before the noise of collective denial drowns out truth. Schopenhauer saw solitude not as a punishment, but as a privilege. He believed that deep thinkers should use their alone time for intellectual and creative pursuits rather than seeking validation from society. Marcus has learned this lesson gradually, painfully. His apartment, once sparse and utilitarian, now houses a small piano, canvases, journals filled with observations. A familiar face approaches, Eleanor, another early riser from his building. Their conversations are rare but meaningful. She teaches quantum physics. He studies human behavior, different fields, similar experiences of isolation. Over the years, they've formed a wordless understanding. Some minds need others who think like them. The sun rises fully now, the city awakening. Marcus watches as people emerge from homes, headphones in, eyes on screens. Schopenhauer warned against blindly sharing deep insights with people who weren't ready for them. Instead, he suggested that thinkers observe society, learn its patterns, and choose their words carefully. Marcus has come to appreciate what he calls intellectual oases, the rare spaces where depth is valued. A monthly philosophy discussion group, an online forum for theoretical physics enthusiasts, a correspondence with a professor in Tokyo who studies the same obscure cognitive biases. These connections, though few, provide essential nourishment for his mind. Deep thinkers throughout history have found different solutions to the dilemma of isolation. Spinoza ground optical lenses for a living, engaging in manual work that allowed his mind freedom to explore revolutionary ideas. Kant never traveled more than 10 miles from his hometown, but journeyed through the universe in his thoughts. Emily Dickinson rarely left her house, but explored the boundaries of human experience through poetry. Marcus has developed his own strategies for navigating a world that prefers simplicity over depth. He's learned to translate complex ideas into accessible metaphors when speaking with most people. He's cultivated patience when others need time to process concepts that seem obvious to him. Most importantly, he's learned to recognize those rare individuals who welcome, rather than fear, intellectual exploration. A study by the University of Melbourne found that highly intelligent people benefit from periodic isolation, using it not just for thinking, but for emotional regulation. The research suggests that what appears to be social awkwardness in deep thinkers might actually be a necessary adaptation, creating space for processing complex information and recovering from the cognitive dissonance of navigating a society built for different minds. Marcus enters a small cafe where the owner, an elderly woman who escaped political persecution in her youth, recognizes the value of quiet thought. She nods as he takes his usual corner table. No music plays here, no televisions blare, just the occasional clink of cups and the rustle of pages turning. She brings him coffee without asking, placing it silently beside his notebook. Small sanctuaries like this exist for those who know to look for them. The German word Weltschmerz, literally world pain, describes the distress caused by comparing the world as it is with the world as it could be. Deep thinkers often experience this acutely. Marcus has learned to transform this pain into purpose, channeling it into writing that might reach others who share his perception. His latest project aims to create bridges between deep thinking and practical action, showing how philosophical insights can improve real lives. Nietzsche, despite his recognition of life's inherent suffering, championed amor fati, the love of one's fate, embracing life with all its pain and complexity. Marcus has gradually moved from mere tolerance of his intellectual isolation to a kind of gratitude for it. His unique perspective allows him to see beauty and patterns invisible to others, to appreciate the full spectrum of human experience, to find meaning in both connection and solitude. The cafe begins to fill as morning advances. A young woman takes a nearby table, opening a dog-eared copy of Schopenhauer, the same edition Marcus treasures. Their eyes meet briefly in recognition. He smiles, remembering his own first encounter with the philosopher's work, how it had simultaneously wounded and healed him, to find his experience so precisely articulated across time and space. Marcus returns to his apartment and opens his laptop. The rejected conference invitation still sits on his desk, but beside it now is a new project, a series of essays written not for academic validation, but for the few who might truly understand. While intelligence may lead to loneliness, it also grants freedom, wisdom, and a deeper understanding of life. The words flow easily now. Have you ever felt that the deeper you think, the more isolated you become? It's not just in your head. Throughout history, those who saw too clearly have faced resistance, not because they were wrong, but because they were right in ways society wasn't ready to acknowledge. But in that isolation lies a strange freedom. As he types, Marcus feels a connection to every deep thinker who came before him and everyone who will follow, a lineage of minds that exists outside time, united by the courage to see clearly despite the cost. In this moment, he understands what Schopenhauer meant when he wrote that true intelligence ultimately leads not to despair, but to compassion, for others trapped in illusions, and for oneself, bearing the weight of clarity in a world that prefers comforting shadows. The city continues its rhythms outside his window, neither fully aware of nor completely indifferent to the deep currents of thought flowing through certain rare minds. Marcus pauses, considering whether his words will find their intended audience. Then he continues typing, knowing that even if they don't, the act of articulating truth holds its own value, a testament to the human capacity to see beyond comfortable illusions and still choose to engage with life, to create meaning where none is given, to find connection despite difference. In the end, perhaps this is the paradoxical peace available to deep thinkers. Not the elimination of tension between themselves and society, but the acceptance of that tension as the very condition that makes their unique perspective possible. Not freedom from the pain of seeing clearly, but freedom through that clear seeing. Not an escape from the curse Schopenhauer described, but the transformation of that curse into an unconventional blessing.